This advice pleased Maymun and Danhasch, and the fairy at once transformed herself into a gnat, and settling on Camaralzaman's throat, stung him so sharply that he awoke. As he did so, his eyes fell on the Princess of China. Surprised at finding a lady so near him, he raised himself on one arm to look at her. The youth and beauty of the princess at once awoke a feeling to which his heart had yet been a stranger, and he could not restrain his delight. "What loveliness! What charms! Oh, my heart, my soul!" he exclaimed, as he kissed her forehead and her eyes, in a way that certainly would have roused her had the genie's enchantments not kept her asleep. "How, fair lady," he cried, "you do not wake at the signs of Camaralzaman's love. Be you who you may, he is not unworthy of you." Suddenly it occurred to him that perhaps this was the bride his father had destined for him, and that the king had probably placed her in his room in order to see how far Camaralzaman's aversion to marriage would withstand her charms. "In all events, I will take this ring as a remembrance of her." So saying, he drew off a fine ring which the princess wore on her finger, and replaced it by one of his own, after which he lay down again and was soon fast asleep. Then Danhasch, in his turn, took the form of a gnat and bit the princess on her lip. She started up and was not a little amazed at seeing a young man beside her. From surprise, she soon passed to admiration, and then to delight in perceiving how handsome and fascinating he was. "Why," cried she, "was it you my father wished me to marry? How unlucky that I did not know sooner. I should not have made him so angry, but wake up, wake up. I know I shall love you with all of my heart." So saying, she shook Camaralzaman so violently that nothing but the spells of Maymun could have prevented his wakening. "Oh," cried the princess, "why are you so drowsy?" So saying, she took his hand and noticed her own ring on his finger, which made her wonder still more. But as he still remained in a profound slumber, she pressed a kiss on his cheek and soon fell fast asleep too. Then Maymun, turning to the genie, said, "Well, are you satisfied that my prince surpasses your princess? Another time, pray believe me when I assert anything." Then turning to Kashkash, she said, "My thanks to you. And now do you and Danhasch bear the princess back to her own home." The two genii hastened to obey, and Maymun returned to her well. On waking next morning, the first thing Prince Camaralzaman did was to look around for the lovely lady he had seen, and, next, to question the slave who waited on him about her. But the slave persisted so strongly that he knew nothing of any lady, and still less of how she got into the tower, that the prince lost all patience, tied a rope around him, and ducked him in the well, till the unfortunate man cried out that he would tell everything. Then the prince drew him up all dripping wet, but the slave begged leave to change his clothes first, and as soon as the prince consented, hurried off just as he was to the palace. Here he found the king talking to the Grand Vizier about the anxiety his son had caused him. The slave was admitted at once and cried, "Alas, sire, I bring sad news to your majesty. There can be no doubt that the prince has completely lost his senses. He declares that he saw a lady sleeping on his couch last night, and the state you see me in proves how violent a contradiction makes him." He then gave a minute account of all the prince had said and done. The king, much moved, begged the vizier to examine into this new misfortune, and the latter went at once to the tower, where he found the prince quietly reading a book. After the first exchange of greetings, the vizier said, "I feel really angry with your slave for alarming his majesty by the news he brought him." "What news?" asked the prince. "Ah," replied the vizier, "something absurd, I feel sure, seeing how I find you." "Most likely," said the prince. "But now that you are here, I am glad of the opportunity to ask you where is the lady who slept in this room last night." The Grand Vizier felt beside himself at this question. "Prince," he exclaimed, "how would it be possible for any man, much less a woman, to enter this room at night without walking over your slave on the threshold? Pray consider the matter, and you will realize that you have been deeply impressed by some dream." But the prince angrily insisted on knowing who and where the lady was, and was not to be persuaded by all the vizier's protestations to the contrary, that the plot had not been one of his making. At last, losing patience, he seized the vizier by the beard and loaded him with blows. "Stop, prince!" cried the unhappy vizier. "Stay and hear what I have to say." The prince, whose arm was getting tired, paused. "I confess, Prince," said the vizier, "that there is some foundation for what you say, but you know well that a minister has to carry out his master's orders. Allow me to go and take to the king any message you may choose to send." "Very well," said the prince. "Then go and tell him that I consent to marry the lady whom he sent or brought here last night. Be quick and bring me back his answer." The vizier bowed to the ground and hastened to leave the room and tower. "Well," asked the king as soon as he appeared, "and how did you find my son?" "Alas, sire," was the reply, "the slave's report is only too true." He then gave an exact account of his interview with Camaralzaman, and of the prince's fury when told it was not possible for any lady to have entered his room, and of the treatment he himself had received. The king, much distressed, determined to clear up the matter himself, and ordering the vizier to follow him, set out to visit his son. The prince received his father with profound respect, and the king, making him sit beside him, asked him several questions, to which Camaralzaman replied with much good sense. At last the king said, "My son, pray tell me about the lady who, it is said, was in your room last night." "Sire," replied the prince, "pray do not increase my distress in this matter, but rather make me happy by giving her to me in marriage. However much I may have objected to matrimony formerly, the sight of this lovely girl has overcome all my prejudices, and I will gratefully receive her from your hands." The king was almost speechless on hearing his son, but after a time assured him most solemnly that he knew nothing whatever about the lady in question, and had not connived at her appearance. He then desired the prince to relate the whole story to him. Camaralzaman did so at great length, showed the ring, and implored his father to help find the bride he so ardently desired. "After all you tell me," remarked the king, "I can no longer doubt your word. But how and whence the lady came, or why she should have stayed so short a time, I cannot imagine. The whole affair is indeed mysterious. Come, my dear son, let us wait together for happier days." So saying, the king took Camaralzaman by the hand and led him back to the palace, where the prince took to his bed and gave himself up to despair. The king, shutting himself up with his son, entirely neglected his duty in the affairs of state. The Prime Minister, who was the only person admitted, felt it his duty at last to tell the king how much the court, and all the people, complained of his seclusion, and how bad it was for the nation. He urged the Sultan to remove with the prince to a lovely little island close by, whence he could easily attend public audiences, and where the charming scenery and fine air would do the invalid so much good as to enable him to bear his father's occasional absence. The king approved the plan, and as soon as the castle on the island could be prepared for their reception, he and the prince arrived there, Schahzaman never leaving his son except for the prescribed public audiences twice a week. While all this was happening in the capital of Schahzaman, the two genii had carefully borne the Princess of China back to her own palace and replaced her in bed. On waking the next morning, she first turned from one side to the other, then, finding herself alone, called loudly for her women. "Tell me," she cried, "where is the young man I love so dearly and who slept near me last night?" "Princess," exclaimed the nurse, we cannot tell what you allude to without more explanation." "Why," continued the princess, "the most charming and beautiful young man lay sleeping beside me last night. I did my utmost to wake him, but in vain." "Your Royal Highness wishes to make game of us," said the nurse. "Is it your pleasure to rise?" "I am quite in earnest," persisted the princess, "and I want to know where he is." "But, princess," expostulated the nurse, "we left you quite alone last night, and we have seen no one enter your room since then." At this, the princess lost all patience, and taking the nurse by her hair, she boxed her ears soundly, crying out, "You will tell me, you old witch!" The nurse had no little trouble in escaping, and hurried off to the queen, to whom she related the whole story with tears in her eyes. "You see, madam," she concluded, "that the princess must be out of her mind. If only you will come and see her, you will be able to judge for yourself." The queen hurried to her daughter's apartments, and after tenderly embracing her, asked her why she had treated her nurse so badly. "Madam," said the princess, "I perceive that your majesty wishes to make game of me, but I can assure you I will never marry anyone except the charming young man who I saw last night. You must know where he is, so pray send for him." The queen was much surprised by these words, but when she declared she knew nothing whatever of the matter, the princess lost all respect and answered that if she were not allowed to marry as she wished, she should kill herself, and it was in vain that the queen tried to pacify her and bring her to reason. The king himself came to hear the rights of the matter, but the princess only persisted in her story, and as a proof showed the ring on her finger. The king hardly knew what to make of it all, but ended by thinking that his daughter was more crazy than ever, and without further argument he had her placed in still closer confinement, with only her nurse to wait on her and a powerful guard to keep the door. Then he assembled his council and, having told them all the sad state of things, added, "If any of you can succeed in curing the princess, I will give her to him in marriage, and he shall be my heir." An elderly emir present, fired with the desire to have a young and lovely wife and to rule over a great kingdom, offered to try the magic arts with which he was acquainted. "You are welcome to try," said the king, "but I make one condition. Should you fail, you will lose your life." The emir accepted the condition, and the king led him to the princess, who, veiling her face, remarked, "I am surprised, sire, that you should bring an unknown man into my presence." "You need not be shocked," said the king. "This is one of my emirs who asks your hand in marriage." "Sire," replied the princess, "this is not the one you gave me before and whose ring I wear. Permit me to say that I can accept no other." The emir, who had expected to hear the princess talk nonsense, finding how calm and reasonable she was, assured the king that he could not venture to undertake a cure, but placed his head at his majesty's disposal. This was the first of many suitors for the princess, whose inability to cure her cost them their lives. Now it happened that after things had been going on in this way for some time, the nurse's son Marzavan returned from his travels. He had been in many countries and learned many things, including astrology. Needless to say that one of the first things his mother told him was the sad condition of the princess, his foster sister. Marzavan asked if she could not manage to let him see the princess without the king's knowledge. After some consideration, his mother consented, and even persuaded the eunuch on guard to make no objection to Marzavan's entering the royal apartment. The princess was delighted to see her foster brother again, and she confided to him all her history and the cause of her imprisonment. Marzavan listened with downcast eyes and the utmost attention. When she had finished speaking, he said, "If what you tell me, princess, is indeed the case, I do not despair of finding comfort for you. Take patience yet a little longer. I will set out at once to explore other countries, and when you hear of my return, be sure that he for whom you sigh is not far off." So saying, he took his leave and started the next morning on his travels. Marzavan journeyed from city to city and from one island and province to another, and wherever he went he heard people talk of the strange story of Princess Badoura, as the Princess of China was named. After 4 months he reached a large populous seaport named Torf, and here he heard no more of Princess Badoura, but a great deal of Prince Camaralzaman, who was reported ill, and whose story sounded very similar to that of Princess Badoura. Marzavan was rejoiced and set out at once for Prince Camaralzaman's residence. The ship on which he embarked had a prosperous voyage, till she got within sight of the capital of King Shahzaman. But when just about to enter the harbour, she suddenly struck on a rock and foundered within sight of the palace where the prince was living with his father and the Grand Vizier. Marzavan, who swam well, threw himself into the sea and managed to land close to the palace, where he was kindly received, and after having a change of clothing given him, was brought before the Grand Vizier. The Vizier was at once attracted by the young man's superior air and intelligent conversation, and perceiving that he had gained much experience in the course of his travels, he said, "Oh, how I wish you had learned some secret which might enable you to cure a malady which has plunged this court into affliction for some time past." Marzavan replied that if he knew what the illness was, he might possibly be able to suggest a remedy, on which the Vizier related to him the whole history of Prince Camaralzaman. On hearing this, Marzavan rejoiced inwardly, for he felt sure that he had at last discovered the object of the Princess Badoura's infatuation. However, he said nothing, but begged to be allowed to see the prince. On entering the royal apartment, the first thing which struck him was the prince himself, who lay stretched out on his bed with his eyes closed. The king sat near him, but without paying any regard to his presence, Marzavan exclaimed, "Heavens, what a striking likeness!" And indeed, there was a great deal of resemblance between the features of Camaralzaman and those of the Princess of China. These words caused the prince to open his eyes with languid curiosity, and Marzavan seized this moment to pay him his compliments, contriving at the same time to express the condition of the Princess of China in terms unintelligible indeed to the Sultan and his vizier, but which left the prince in no doubt that his visitor could give him some welcome information. The prince begged his father to allow him the favour of a private interview with Marzavan, and the king, only too pleased to find his son taking an interest in anyone or anything, agreed. As soon as they were left alone, Marzavan told the prince the story of the Princess Badoura and her sufferings, adding, "I am convinced that you alone can cure her, but before starting on so long a journey you must be well and strong, so do your best to recover as quickly as may be." These words produced a great effect on the prince, who was so much cheered up by the hopes held out that he declared he felt himself able to get up and dressed. The king was overjoyed at the result of Marzavan's interview and ordered public rejoicings in order of the prince's recovery. Before long, the prince was quite restored to his original state of health, and as soon as he felt himself really strong, he took Marzavan aside and said, "Now is the time to perform your promise. I am so impatient to see my beloved princess once more that I am sure I shall fall ill again if we do not start soon. The one obstacle is my father's tender care of me, for as you may have noticed, he cannot bear me out of his sight." "Prince," replied Marzavan, "I have already thought over the matter, and this is what seems to me the best plan. You have not been outdoors since my arrival. Ask the king's permission to go with me for 2 or 3 days hunting, and when he has given leave, order 2 good horses to be held ready for each of us. Leave all the rest to me." Next day the prince seized a favourable opportunity for making his request, and the king gladly granted it on the condition that only 1 night should be spent out for fear of too great a fatigue after such a long illness. Next morning, Prince Camaralzaman and Marzavan were off betimes, attended by 2 grooms leading the 2 extra horses. They hunted a little by the way, but took great care to get as far from the towns as possible. At nightfall they reached an inn, where they supped and slept till midnight. Then Marzavan awoke and roused the prince without disturbing anyone else. He begged the prince to give him the coat he had been wearing, and to put on another which they had brought with them. They mounted their 2nd horses, and Marzavan led one of the groom's horses by the bridle. By daybreak the travellers found themselves where 4 crossroads met in the middle of a forest. Here Marzavan begged the prince to wait for him, and leading the groom's horse into a dense part of the wood, he cut its throat, dipped the prince's coat in its blood, and, having rejoined the prince, threw the coat on the ground where the roads parted. In answer to Camaralzaman's inquiries as to the reason for this, Marzavan replied that the only chance that they had of continuing their journey was to divert attention by creating the idea of the prince's death. "Your father will doubtless be plunged into the deepest grief," he went on, "but his joy at your return will be all the greater." The prince and his companion now continued their journey by land and sea, and as they had brought plenty of money to defray their expenses, they met with no needless delays. At length they reached the capital of China, where they spent 3 days in a suitable lodging to recover from their fatigues. During this time Marzavan had an astrologer's dress prepared for the prince. Then they went to the baths, after which the prince put on the astrologer's robe, and was conducted within sight of the king's palace by Marzavan, who left him there and went to consult with his mother, the princess's nurse. Meantime the prince, according to Marzavan's instructions, advanced close to the palace gates and there proclaimed aloud, "I am an astrologer, and I come to restore health to the Princess Badoura, daughter of the high and mighty King of China, on the condition laid down by His Majesty of marrying her should I succeed, or losing my life if I fail." It was some time since anybody had presented himself to run the terrible risk involved in attempting to cure the princess, and a crowd soon gathered around the prince. On perceiving his youth, good looks, and distinguished bearing, everyone felt pity for him. "What are you thinking of, sir?" exclaimed some. "Why expose yourself to certain death? Are the heads you see exposed on the tower walls sufficient warning or not? Mercy's sake, give up this mad idea and retire while you can." But the prince remained firm and only repeated his cry with greater assurance, to the horror of the crowd. "He is resolved to die," they cried. "May heaven have pity on him." Camaralzaman now called out for the third time, and at last the Grand Vizier himself came out and fetched him in. The Prime Minister led the prince to the king, who was much struck by the noble air of this new adventurer, and felt such pity for the fate so evidently in store for him, that he tried to persuade the young man to renounce his project. Camaralzaman politely yet firmly persisted in his intentions, and at length the king desired the eunuch, who had the guard of the princess's apartment, to conduct the astrologer to her presence. The eunuch led the way through the long passages, and Camaralzaman followed rapidly, in haste to reach the object of his desires. At last they came to a large hall, which was the anteroom to the princess's chamber, and here Camaralzaman said to the eunuch, "Now you shall choose. Shall I cure the princess in her own presence, or shall I do it in here without seeing her?" The eunuch, who had expressed many contemptuous doubts as they came along of the newcomer's powers, was much surprised, and said, "If you really can cure, it is immaterial where you do it. Your fame will be equally great." "Very well," replied the prince. "Then, impatient though I am to see the princess, I will effect the cure where I stand, the better to convince you of my power." He accordingly drew out his writing case and wrote as follows: "Adorable princess, the enamoured Camaralzaman has never forgotten the moment when, contemplating your sleeping beauty, he gave you his heart. As he was at that time deprived of the happiness of conversing with you, he ventured to give you his ring as a token of his love, and to take yours in exchange, which he now encloses in this letter. Should you deign to return it to him, he will be the happiest of mortals. If not, he will cheerfully resign himself to death, seeing he does so for love of you. He awaits your reply in your anteroom." Having finished this note, the prince carefully enclosed the ring in it without letting the eunuch see it, and gave him the letter, saying, "Take this to your mistress, my friend, and if on reading it and seeing its contents she is not instantly cured, you may call me an impudent impostor." The eunuch at once passed into the princess's room, and handing her the letter said, "Madam, a new astrologer has arrived, who declares that you will be cured as soon as you have read this letter and seen what it contains." See you tomorrow.